Welcome to Racket Fanatic Podcast, Tales of a Tennis Legend. Every week I'll be telling a story about the greatest players to have ever played the game. In this series we're talking about Pete Sampras, and this is episode 9, A Champion's Mind. So now that I've read about Pete Sampras and looked into his history and read his autobiography, I wanted to do a bit of a piece about him, about how does someone manage to achieve so much and become so great within their sport. And it all whittles down to one thing, really. It's his mindset. He admits himself that from an early age, he always believed that he would be a tennis player. He'd always believed that he'd be a tennis pro. He had that inner faith, which brings that inner peace and calm, knowing that everything's going to work out. And I think that's a fantastic, amazing mindset to have. But for the most part, he carried that through all the way his career. As tennis is a game of margins, when he needed those big points, when it did come down to the wire, he was always able to pull through. And it all comes down to his mindset. Sometimes you look at these players and you look at their stats and you look at the way they compose themselves, especially Pete. He was so cool, he was so calm and collected. Whether he won a point, lost a point, he'd barely show any emotion. And you just come to the assumption that, oh, that's just them and everything must be working amazingly for them. But when you peel back the layers, you realize this is something he's formed, and this is something that you realize that's just a very clever way of controlling your emotions, keeping yourself mentally stable throughout the match for all the points, and to also intimidate the opponent. And Pete admits that when he was younger, he was a little bit fiery. He said he was always more of a reserved kid, but he would have tantrums and be a racket thrower. So it is something that he had to develop. So even though he had that belief from a young age, he still had to develop that cool, calm, collected personality, on-court personality. And as well as looking at this, you think, oh, everything must just be perfect in this person's life and the number one in the world. And from the outside, it appears everything's fine, that everything is working and operating perfectly. But when you peel away the layers, you realize that's not the case at all. He's been through so much tragedy in his personal life and so many little hurdles along the way. You realize it's not plain sailing for one and then struggles for everybody else. He has just as many struggles. It's just he's able to put that aside, mentally deal with it, and still go to work. He's able to perform on a tennis court, and regardless of what's happening outside in his personal life off the tennis court, he's able to perform. He's able to win, and that is the difference. And his records show that. For 6 years consecutive, he ended as world number one. He's won 14 Grand Slams, and he's talking about the journey through that. He could feel the pressure of having that goal of trying to get 6 consecutive years as ending as number one. He wanted to beat Jimmy Connor's record, who had 5 years, and for the last couple of years, he really felt the pressure. He had to play a certain amount of tournaments and he had to perform to a certain level. He had to win these tournaments and consistently do well. So this was all self-inflicted pressure because he wanted to be the best that he could be. The way he explains it is he had a gift and he wanted to maximize that gift to its maximum potential. And he felt the pressure, and at one time towards the end, he completely emotionally offloaded to his coach and said, "Look, I'm really struggling here. This is what I'm going through." So he admits at times he did feel the pressure of his own goals and consistently being world number one with that target on his back, everyone trying to beat him. But the difference is he handles it, he manages it. Sometimes he can do it on his own. Sometimes he needs to speak with his coach or his team to get him through. But either way, he handles it. He takes on that pressure and moves forward and wins matches. It's an amazing, very special trait to have. And while trying to achieve these goals of winning Grand Slams every year, ending the year as world number one, all the things that unravelled in his personal life. A close friend of his died, Vitas Gerolitis. A few months later, his coach that he used to tour with, Tim Gullickson, was diagnosed with a brain tumour and died the year later. I talk about that in a previous episode where he breaks down on court in tears, but still manages to win the match. His childhood coach, Pete Fisher, who coached him from 7, 8 years old up until he was a late teen, ended up being a convicted paedophile. The story is ridiculous. This was the year after his current coach died. Previous coach, Pete Fisher, was charged with this molestation accusations and ended up serving time and ended up going to jail for these accusations. Pete talks briefly about it over. He had obviously had no idea about the accusations. He had no experience of that himself. But either way, to go through your friend dying, your coach dying, and then your childhood coach then being a convicted paedophile and going to jail all within the space of a couple of years, just for anybody would be a lot. And remember, Pete's in his 20s here. He's still, on the grand scheme of things, he's a kid, isn't he? You know, you're a young man in your 20s. So for all this to happen and still had the career that he had, it's unbelievable, because if you applied that same situation to other people, they'd have a wobble or they struggle in life. But even though I know all this, just watching Pete Sampras on court, you wouldn't know. And he was always very calm and collected in interviews. He tried to shy away from the limelight and just focus on his tennis and let his racket do the talking. So all this chaos going on in his personal life, and you'd never know. As well as that, there's the injuries. Of course, all athletes have injuries, but it's just something else that he managed to get through that you wouldn't know. He used to practice that much. So his coach recommended that he practice harder on his serve. His serve is a masterpiece, and part of that was practicing excessively. So his arm he used to get dead arm and quite severe pain in his arm. So he started taking Advil, like pain relief, but excessively, too much, and from that caused a stomach ulcer and started to throw up at random. There's actually a match where he played Agassi in the final, and they had to delay the final because he was thrown up before the match, and they had to delay it. He lied. He said, "Oh, I'm just ill," because he didn't want to explain to people the problem. As someone with a Greek background, a Mediterranean man, a lot of people from that region struggle with a condition called thalassemia, which is basically an issue with your red blood count. So what that means is, in extreme heat, you struggle. You're not producing enough quality red blood cells. This was also a condition that he was managing throughout his career. There was many times after a tennis match he'd have to be hooked up to an IV drip because he was that dehydrated and weak under extreme heat conditions. But again, you would just never know. You wouldn't know this. He's not one to look for pity. He kept this all to himself, and it was all to create that image of Pete Sampras is a stone, is immovable, to create that fear amongst the players. The message here is everybody, including Pete Sampras, has issues and problems along their journey. The difference, a champion's mindset gets through it and puts it aside when it's time to play, when it's time to perform, when it's time to go to work. He puts it aside and does his job and wins. And that's why he's so special. Towards the end of his career, the last couple of years, he was starting to struggle with his game. He was getting older. The new players were coming through. He could sense time was against him. And he wasn't playing as well the last couple of years. And he had quite a series of losses and started to drop slightly down the rankings. But he set himself a goal that he wanted to win one last Grand Slam before he retires. So he has the US Open in his sights and has an unbelievable run and manages to get all the way to the final, where he plays his lifelong career rival, Andre Agassi, and manages to beat Andre in the final. It's a beautifully romantic ending. is where he won his first Grand Slam, and it was his last tournament, his last Grand Slam that he won. He plays against his career-long rival, who he played in, Andre Agassi, who's played throughout his career, but also he played in the final when he won his first Grand Slam, and now he's playing in the final of his last Grand Slam. So it's very poetic, very romantic, and this is where he plays his last match before he retires. As I threw my arms in the air after winning what would be my last Grand Slam, I let out a primal scream that nobody seemingly heard or noticed. I hollered, "I fucking did it!" The match had proven to be the final and most daunting hurdle of my career. I'd experienced 2 years of adversity with people breathing down my neck, and had found one last ticket to that place where I was completely focused and sufficiently confident to get the job done. When it was over, I felt great. And that's where I leave it for today at Racket Fanatic Podcast, Tales of a Tennis Legend. I'll see you next week.